Good evening. Welcome to the Église Sainte-Thérèse in Hirson. At the piano, we often play music which was not written for the piano. This is partly because much of the music that we play nowadays with great enjoyment is from a past or from a distant enough past where this instrument did not exist. And this means that actually, since we have in our day this wonderful possibility of having access to many centuries of music literature, which perhaps has never been the case in the whole history of our art, that we actually are in a kind of double function as keepers of the flame, but also as museum curators. Of course, there comes this question of authenticity, which has been very often discussed and will never be resolved. I'm not here to try to resolve it, but I would like to think about splitting this question, first of all, into two parts, namely why and how. Now, as I said, I cannot give a solution to the question of why, meaning why do we play music that was not written for this instrument on this instrument. I think there are many very good reasons. The reason that I would like to focus on is that it can be very beautiful. Much of the music which we consider to be on paper organ music or harpsichord music is very beautiful piano music. Let's think about the works of Johann Sebastian Bach. Of course, he never heard them on the piano. Of course, he would not think of these ways that the great musicians of the last 100 years have thought of to make his music into something that is really suited to this instrument and not only can be reproduced on this instrument, but actually offer something new and interesting and striking based on the qualities of this instrument. Or, in other words, which show off the best part or the best side of the piano. There is such a thing as beautiful Bach playing on the piano, which is entirely distinct from beautiful Bach playing on other instruments, and is not a kind of imitation of the latter. Well, that's what I think. I know that many people whom I esteem may be of a different opinion. They try to, at least at a technical level, play Bach on the piano as if it were not a piano. I've never really tried to do this on a high level, if you put it that way. It basically means playing without pedal, trying to play each note at the same volume, and showing what there is to show by means that exist already on Bach's instrument. These means are primarily the so-called agogics, meaning that one pushes and pulls timing in its widest sense, and what you could call articulation, which is actually a bit of an unfortunate term because it does not really correspond in music to its etymological sense. I think the kind of articulation that one can do on the piano is more related to what one calls, at least what one assumes to be articulation in language, meaning to speak in an articulate manner, and not to do with joints. So let me try to give a few examples. Now, first of all, let me try to imitate harpsichord playing on the piano. of course, people who think of this kind of imitation as being the basis of all Bach playing on the piano would do this much better than I have just done. But you see the sort of the characteristics that I have tried to show about even volume, about articulating the notes, and of course avoiding all that which is idiosyncratic to the piano. Now let me try to do something in some ways exactly opposite. Namely, I'm going to try to make as many piano colors as I can using these notes. Of course, one thing which I cannot avoid is that it's a question of character. It's a question of what kind of character one wants this piece to have in one's interpretation. But if we try to leave that question aside and just think of the actual the actual sound aesthetic, let me start with the details. Of course, I do something which I would not do. I did something which I would not do in a concert nowadays, which is to play the left hand in a so-called legato way. Arguably, this is the way that brings to fore the finest qualities of the modern piano, which is an instrument that in all of the registers is capable of making singing lines. Another thing which I try to do is to see not individual notes, but rather groups of notes as creating a cumulative sound. This is, of course, to do with harmony. So based on an understanding of how these notes within a line interact with each other harmonically, one can find moments where the cumulative sound has a particular quality and has a particular, you could say, optical brilliance, or a light effect, or a color. Now, there's a latent polyphony in this line, which means that, well, let me show it first. So already in the first bar you see that there is this repeated, so we have. Now, if we take this repeated E and consider it to be another voice, and we give it a certain shape, which is independent of the shape that we give to the rest of the notes, then already we have two lines. And the idea of this kind of atmospheric piano playing is to make an image of sound which is as complex and as interesting and as multifaceted as possible. So there, of course, if I want to show it within a single bar, I have to exaggerate in an unmusical way. Well, later we get this polyphony, which actually implies a chain of suspensions. So if one tries to separate these lines, or at least to give them separate shapes, then of course one requires the properties of the piano, which is an instrument that it's almost telling its player to modulate in real time the dynamics and the specific meanings of each note. Now, this is a kind of Bach playing which in a certain way is like taking something black and white and coloring it. Now, we know from obvious examples of from history, from art history, that this can be done very, very badly. And it is a fundamental danger of going down this route that one makes kitsch. If we're thinking of just magnifying all the things that are already in the music, we're trying to see what is latent in the music, what kind of effects are already there, and we try to make these effects even bigger, then we have this real problem that we start getting something which is very round, very shiny, and very smooth. Well, I mean, of course, these are mental analogies. Now, it can also be done very well if we look at drawings which have been made on the basis of woodcuts, for example, or of engravings. That in these drawings we see the white heightening, which gives a whole new a new plane of beauty. I'm not saying that it's somehow improving the original, but it simply speaks to the aesthetic sense of beauty on an additional level. And this additional level, in the case of music, is perhaps something which we welcome in the concert situation, which of course is a situation for which these pieces were not necessarily conceived. There's another side to this idea of playing music using means which were not available to it at the time of its conception, and that is the so-called transcription, which actually, when one gets down to it, when one's actually doing it, is a very similar thing. I have just transcribed a few bars of the French suite for piano from the harpsichord, one could say. One thing that I have done with a certain conviction is play Bach's organ music on the piano. Well, I think that the piano, especially if you put it in a place like this, of course, sounds a lot more like the organ than it does like the harpsichord. And the music is, of course, wonderful and can gain something by being played on a personal instrument like this. I say personal because it is an instrument where you can express yourself in real time, in a different and more immediate way than on the organ, just by the fact that you are absolutely in control within the possibilities of the instrument at the time that you are playing of how the next thing is going to sound. So with the organ music, let me just mention two things which I very much enjoy about playing it on the piano. The first is related to this idea of being able to express oneself at the moment. And the second is actually, paradoxically, that there are certain things that one can even make more clear, that one can be more true to the score. Or let's say one can better show what is in the score at an instrument like the piano. I'm thinking of, for example, this chorale prelude on the rivers of Babylon. So in this introduction, we basically see the principle upon which this piece is built. Now, it's an incredibly strictly composed piece in the following sense. So the first two phrases of the chorale melody become the building block for the entire accompaniment of the entire piece, even after the chorale melody has moved on past its first two phrases. And they're always in this combination. So the first one is, and the second one, or in a slightly less ornamented form, and the clever thing, or the building block, is that at every time within the three voices of the accompaniment, because this is a four-voice piece, you have two voices on one manual, you have below that the chorale melody, which just is an ornamented version, but a simply ornamented version of the original melody, and you have a bass. So the two at the top and the bass always have this interaction in which two of these voices are playing these two first lines of melody in some combination with each other. So this is a very difficult thing to show on the organ. In fact, let me just say for what it is. It's impossible unless you know the piece. It's impossible as a listener unless you know that you're listening for this, to really have this enter into your subconscious. And that's, of course, what the music intends. I'm not going to say that the composer intended a certain thing, because that's unscientific. But it is clear that looking at the score, this is what the essential thing that is sort of the reason of being is being represented by. So on the piano, of course, one has the possibility of simply blatantly pointing out whenever one of these two fragments starts in one of the three voices. And that is a technique which, when used well, in my opinion, quite contributes to the enjoyment of this piece. So let me return to the other point that I was saying about expressing oneself as a musician in a more immediate way through using a different instrument. Let's stay with the idea of organ and piano for a few reasons. One of which is because I actually have had the experience of playing these pieces on the organ. Let's take the D minor organ sonata, because that's perhaps the one, the trio sonata, I mean, that's perhaps the one of those six which benefits the most, or which shows a different side of itself in the most striking and beautiful way when played on a piano. And so on. This is a piece to which I have now given a character and an emotional content which is quite unique to instruments like the piano, or I suppose to today's concert chamber music aesthetic, and which is not exactly what I would try to do on the organ, because the organ simply speaks with a different voice. What I would like to emphasize is that this is really like heightening in a drawing. There are a few things it's not about. It's not about creating something which is not there. All the things that one does in this case are actually latent in the score, and one is simply bringing them out in a different way. The effects that exist in the score will be heard and will be felt when it is played in a way or on an instrument that does not profit from these interventions we're talking about. But we want to feel them in a different way. We want to feel them with a different part of the aesthetic sensibility. And sometimes this different part can resonate in a way that is surprising and moving to us. The other thing it's not is trying to imitate the organ with the piano, which has been very often the case with other transcriptions. The most obvious thing that such transcriptions exhibit is the doubling of the bass octaves. If I were to do that here, it would be... I mean, it is probably true that on the organ I would put a sub-bass, a 16-foot register on the pedal part of this. But when I convert this or consider this to be a piano piece, then my ideal becomes not that of how the piece would sound on an organ, but rather of other piano pieces which are similar to this, like the three-part inventions when they are considered to be piano pieces. There is a passage in the first movement of this organ trio sonata which, in terms of organ writing, is really interesting, beautiful and effective. But in terms of piano writing, it is unheard of and really incredibly beautiful. It's a texture in three parts. Of course, all of it is in three parts as a trio sonata. We have the melody on top, which is a kind of derivative of the first theme. And we have a bass line to go with it, which follows the same movement as the beginning of the piece. And then in the middle, we have these arpeggios, which one would never expect in a piece which is ostensibly in a strict contrapuntal style. Now, this is beautiful piano writing, isn't it? By that I mean, this is a combination of notes which makes the piano sound beautiful as a piano can. Of course, Bach being Bach, we later have in this movement the inversion of the texture. And this, of course, is yet another inventive and striking piano color, which of course was not how Bach saw it, because piano color had no meaning to him, but it does to us. And why not take this wonderful piece of music with an expression which has this kind of a deep and intimate melancholic strain, and make a piece out of it, or a moment of music which can be played and can be communicated, can be transmitted in a concert situation in such a way as to make something really quite complete. That's the thought I would like to leave you with. Well, maybe it's interesting just to say a little bit about the other part of the question, the part that's called how, since having split the question of the beginning into why and how, basically just tried to find inroads to the core of the why question. It's particularly interesting in this case because, as I said, what this makes is essentially a kind of extended counterpart to a three-part invention. And the three-part inventions have been played on the piano for a long time in many different contexts, without that one thinks of them as transcriptions. Well, you're going to say the reason is obvious because, the trio sonata has a pedal part which does not fit on this keyboard, unlike the three-part inventions. The truth is, keyboard technique today is very different from keyboard technique back then. We can certainly say that some of the three-part inventions are inconvenient enough for purposes of digitation that putting just simply the notes of the organ trio sonata onto the keyboard as they stand, meaning everything at an 8-foot register on the same manual, is a real possibility. And it is indeed upon that basis that I play this piece on the piano. Just to show you what I mean, there's this three-part invention. So you see that the idea of playing three parts with two hands is basically that the middle part is shared between the hands, and sometimes they are shared in a rhythmically broken up way, which is simply quite inconvenient to play. Now, I do the same thing with the trio sonata. If you look at the first entrance of the third voice, the essential thing is that it's a middle voice which has to be brought out in a melodic way. Now, we know how to do that. A little trick that I use is that when there's a trill in the middle voice, instead of putting the note after the trill in the same hand, I use the other hand to take it. This just is something which doesn't have to be done. I think I'm reasonably confident of being able to play the trill with one hand. But in concert, it feels safer to, especially in a rhythmical sense, to make sure that this G sharp comes exactly at the right point of the 16th. To make sure that this G sharp comes exactly at the right rhythmical point of the semiquaver to just play. A bit later in the exposition, we have this texture. So the top line plays a chain of trills, and the middle voice has a sort of a wavy semiquaver motive, and the bass is playing sort of points. So we have now, obviously, because of the distance, this poses a problem, and the left hand cannot take the two lower voices. Now, of course, the first question is, or the first approach is to try to play the notes as they are in the score without changing them, and to see if there's a way to arrange it. So, since the left hand cannot take the two lower voices, we have two hands and three voices, so the right hand has to take the top two. But this is really not very nice to play. Not nice at all. And of course, actually it's freezing in this church, so I'd probably play it a lot better if my hands were a bit warm. But there's a better solution, and that's to simply let the damper pedal take care of the articulation of the bass, which means that the finger just has to touch these notes, and the left hand can then take the notes in between when it's not occupied with the bass. This way of playing a middle voice alternately with the two hands is actually something that occurs in an obvious way in other works of Bach, and actually not at all did originate with him. You see also in the works of the English virginalists that they knew this technique, and they knew the musical things that it made possible. So here it would make, with the addition of something which is quite unique to the piano, in basically the whole of the musical instrumentarium actually, that we use the damper pedal to create a line and to articulate a line.